Hi, I'm Lester Bryant and I'm from Labour Rate. Please excuse my scruffiness, I'm just in a COVID-19 mode. Now many of us are in business and we wonder what COVID-19 holds for us in the short, the medium and the long term. And what I thought I'd do is just present some information to you. Now this information relates to what I call doom and logic. And this doom all comes about because of the numbers that are out there. So I'm not going to try and convince you of anything. All I'm going to do is present numbers and let you think about those numbers. You'll notice that this is a video. Occasionally there'll be a link that you have to click to carry on to the next slide. And that's because there's a lot of information in some of these slides, but you might want to stop and digest them before you move on. So let's get on with it. On April the 3rd, there was an article that came out about the OECD's concept of where New Zealand would be in the near future. In essence, they were saying that we were going to be worse off than we were after the GFC of 2008 and 9. And there would be an initial drop of around 30% in our GDP. And this raises the question, if there's going to be a 30% drop in our economy, who is likely to collapse first? Is it the business sectors, the banks, or the government? Let's first take a look at how we fit into the world and the world of economics. All the figures you'll see in this next section are in US dollars. What is the amount of debt in the world? The overall amount of debt in the world just before COVID-19 was $255 trillion, which was made up of household, company and government debt. Now the world GDP as a total is $84 trillion. So that means that worldwide debt was around about 3 years of GDP, something that was referred to as the debt bubble, and this has been warned about for quite a while. Given the world has a population of 7.7 billion people, that's $32,500 debt per person. And this debt is increasing rapidly due to the massive amount of fiscal stimulus being conducted right now because of COVID-19. Let's now consider how GDP is shared in the world. As it turns out, the USA has a GDP of roughly $21 trillion. So that makes up approximately 25% of international GDP, while the other 75% is shared between 179 countries. And when we look at the top tier countries, we can see that the United States is 20.58 trillion, and you can see down the line there where China's a closest second and the others start to pale. And there's somewhere way down the line in the 20 plus range is Australia and New Zealand. And New Zealand has a GDP of $0.21 trillion, which is roughly 309 billion New Zealand dollars. When we look at the New Zealand GDP, of $309 billion, we see that tourism is the biggest generator of our GDP at $43 billion, followed by manufacturing at around about 6. GDP is not necessarily indicative of employment. Some of these sectors may appear higher up the list, but they might not employ as many people as down the list. When we consider sector by sector employment, we then also have to consider the total number of employed, which in New Zealand at the end of last year was 2.648 million people. Let's now consider the sectors, and let's consider them as dominoes and how they affect each other as we go through. As you can see, the total tourism expenditure was around $41 billion, and there are 229,566 people employed full-time. But there's also a lot of part-time people or people who are partially dependent on tourism. It's also important to note that there's a lot of money that comes to the government by way of tax from GST. If we were to consider the impact that COVID-19 has on businesses, it's obvious that tourism and hospitality and international students, etc., would be one of the biggest. So it becomes a case of how big will that change be to the tourism and hospitality industry. And what you can see here is I'm doing a prediction of minus 70%, and that's got a very good reason. This cutout here shows the New Zealand tourism figures up to the end of 2018. And in 2018, we had roughly $39.1 billion of tourist and hospitality business. And what you can see there is that nearly 59% of this was domestic tourism. The question becomes, if we remove the international tourism, then surely that leaves us still with a lot of internal tourism. So we all have to accept that there is going to be a lack of international travellers for 1 to 2 or whatever years it's going to be. And at the end of the lockdown, there's going to be a lot of airlines out of business. So you also have to anticipate that the cost of international travel is going to be quite a bit more expensive. It could be 4 times as much. Travel may become unaffordable given that New Zealand is so far removed from all the other countries. In 2018, about 60% of the tourism spend was domestic tourism, and there are current predictions that domestic tourism will return quickly after the lockdown. I'm going to say that domestic tourism is probably as doomed as international tourism is. So how soon will it be before our tourism sector gets back on its feet? Well, I don't think it will. And this is the reasons why. The majority of New Zealanders will have made some or all of the following decisions. Number one, they've used up their current holiday leave to supplement the cash shortfall of the wage subsidy that was put in place. Number two, they took on a form of mortgage holiday that requires a pay down or a catch-up mode. Number three, they also applied for a rent holiday that now requires a pay down or catch-up mode. And if they're a landlord, then they've asked for a mortgage or release holiday to help them catch up. They are now on reduced hours, reduced workloads and lower pays. Their households have expanded and they are now supporting more dependents. They are now on a lower hourly rate or take less drawings from the company. And before COVID-19 they were both working, but now only one is, so they are barely surviving. So this removes any hope that New Zealand holiday regions can rely on internal tourism to reinvigorate their economies. Add to this that taxation and local body rates are likely to increase to be higher before, and as a proportion of revenue their costs have just gone up. The fact is, people are now cash poor and time rich. Their spending habits will reflect this very quickly. Before we move on to consider how this plays out, I just want to remind you of one simple thing. The government has already spent a lot of money on our behalf trying to get us to bridge between COVID-19 and a total economic collapse. And to date, they've spent an extra $52 billion. So let me move on. If you accept that the tourism and hospitality industry is in for a big hit, and we're going to lose a lot of GDP because of it, then it pays to also consider what is the next domino in that chain. And the next domino in that chain is construction, and there's a very good reason for that. The reason is that a lot of major projects are being undertaken in New Zealand, from the Auckland Airport revamp to a lot of hotels, convention centres and the likes, and all of those relied on that tourist and international sector. Without that, construction starts to see projects pulled, not started, or even boarded up because there is no commercial viability in those projects anymore. So we're going to see an almost instant impact on construction within 1 to 2 months. Now construction will go away far greater than 55% initially, but over the next year you're likely to find that construction is significantly over-resourced and we only need 50-55% of what we had before. This leads me on to Dominoes 3 and 4, which are transport and public administration. With tourism and construction both under jeopardy, a lot of transportation and a lot of public administration is no longer required. So we're going to see some major drops in those as well. Now if you look to the right, you can see my predictions on what the GDP drop will be for each sector. And overall, you're going to see a GDP drop of over $36 billion. And that's a drop from $309 billion. Also a large increase in the number of people that are unemployed, underemployed, and there'll be a decrease in wages. Theoretically, this will cause a larger tax take as a percentage of GDP by the government. It's important to consider what the government takes out of the equation. So what will this cost the government? So let's look at employment figures. Well, we all know that the stimulus the government's conducted so far is about trying to keep people employed. But if you follow the rationale previously, you can see that it's almost impossible, particularly with regards to tourism. And we know that 229,000 people are employed directly in it, a further 160,000 indirectly need to benefit from it. Then we've got an employment pool of 390,000 people dependent on tourism. If we reduce that by 70%, then that's 273,000 unemployed. And if you follow down the unemployed column and add up the figures, given the changes that I've indicated there, you'll see that that total pool of people comes to in excess of 400,000 people. This is a lot of people who may become unemployed. Pre-COVID-19, we had 103,000 unemployed people at around 3.9% of our workforce. Remember that our workforce was 2.648 million people. We can expect there to be somewhere between 400 and 500,000 people unemployed at the end of this. In other words, unemployment is likely to reach 14 to 18% of our employable people. And this leads me on to my first prediction. The Arnold Northmeyer Black Budget in 1958 will look like a white budget in comparison. A New Zealand government will have to deliver on this problem at some stage. As you can see, all of this presents some significant problems for New Zealand. And I want to take you back to my original question, which was, who would collapse first in New Zealand? The business sector, the banks, or the government? This was stage 1 of my Doom and Logic presentation. If you want to know more, just move on to the next video or subscribe so you can see them all.